Australia's population, if you go by the ABS population clock and you basically look at the number right now, which is about 27.7 million, minus where we were at the turn of the century, our population's grown by 8.7 million people nationally. That's 46%. That is the strongest growth in the advanced world. Anybody who lives in a major city in Australia has felt this, right? We've felt it with housing becoming increasingly expensive, harder to rent, harder to buy. Obviously, there's much worse traffic congestion, there's crash loading everywhere. For the net zero heroes out there who pretend to care about the environment, well, obviously, growing the population by 8.7 million people is terrible for the environment. And in fact, the State of the Environment report, which is basically the intergenerational report of the environment, said that population growth is a bigger threat to Australia's natural environment than climate change.
Welcome back to Free Voices. It's great today to be joined by Leith van Onselen. Many of you will know Leith from his commentary on critical issues relating to our economy and in particular on immigration. And I'm really looking forward to our chat today. Just by way of brief background, Leith is Chief Economist at the MB Fund and MB Super. He is Chief Economist and co-founder of MacroBusiness. And Leith previously worked at the Australian Treasury, Victorian Treasury and Goldman Sachs. Leith is also a regular contributor on Sky News and many radio stations across Australia. And Leith is really an important voice in this debate on immigration. There's lots of confusing figures that are put out there, but Leith is consistently somebody who provides a very strong analytical basis for understanding the true size and scale of Australia's migration program. So there is no better time to be talking about this issue than right now. And so Leith, thank you so much for taking your time to have a chat with us today.
Yeah, cheers, Dan. Anytime.
All right, so let's just start. Australia's immigration program, most people know, is at a record high, and that's been the case now for several years, and people can feel this in their lives, in their day-to-day lived experience. What I would love is if you can just put for us briefly, in a bit of a historical context, just how big the immigration program currently is.
Yeah, for sure. So for about 60 years after World War II, Australia's net overseas migration, so that's basically the net flow of migrants coming into the country, it averaged 90,000 people per year for 60 years, up to 2004. And in only 2 of those 60 years did it exceed 150,000. And it only just exceeded 150,000, so not by much. And then in the early 2000s, the Howard government was lobbied by the business lobby, etc., to raise immigration, which it did. And every subsequent government after that has basically run very big migration. So to put some numbers around that, I'll just mention, so we had 90,000 per year for 60 years post World War II was the average, the annual average. In the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, so up to the end of 2019, net overseas migration shot up from that 90,000 up to 220,000, where it averaged that for 15 years. And that was the big Australia period, under Kevin Rudd and then subsequently the coalition. And then in the last 5 years leading up to the end of 2024, despite the fact that we had lockdowns and despite the fact that the borders were closed for several years, net overseas migration has averaged 265,000. So that's obviously the last couple of years, which have been insane, where we had about 1 million for over 2 years. But even if you account for those lockdown years, net overseas migration has shot up again to 265,000. So we've gone from 90 for 60 years, 220,000 for 15 years, last 5 years, 265,000. So it just keeps ratcheting up. And what this basically means to the ordinary person in the street, Dan, is massive population pressure. So Australia's population, if you go by the ABS population clock and you basically look at the number right now, which is about 27.7 million, minus where we were at the turn of the century, around about the time of the Sydney Olympics, our population's grown by 8.7 million people nationally. That's 46%. That is the strongest growth in the advanced world, right? So we've had this extreme population growth. You and I both live in Melbourne. We've seen Melbourne's population go from about 3.5 million to roughly 5.5 million currently. If you live in Sydney, you've gone from about 3.8 million to roughly 5.5 million. And, anybody who lives in a major city in Australia has felt this, right? We've felt it with housing becoming increasingly expensive, harder to rent, harder to buy. Also poorer quality, because nowadays, people have to live in apartments instead of houses. It's further out if you want a house. So, obviously, there's much worse traffic congestion. There's crash loading everywhere. in infrastructure and services and, schools and hospitals and left, right and centre. And, for those who, for the net zero heroes out there who pretend to care about the environment, well, obviously growing the population by 8.7 million people is terrible for the environment. And in fact, the State of the Environment report, which is the basically the intergenerational report of the environment, the last one we got was in 2021, it gets released every 5 years, said that population growth is a bigger threat to Australia's natural environment than climate change, right? So all the people who complain about net zero and everything, they should be complaining about population growth. It's actually a bigger threat. And obviously growing the population by 46% this century makes it a lot harder to meet net zero. Because if you keep importing more people into the country, you got more people who are using energy, consuming things, growing emissions. It makes it harder to meet that net zero target. So this is an issue, no matter where you stand, that people should care about. Because I call immigration an everything issue, because it basically affects almost every part of your quality of life, your day-to-day life. How long you're stuck in traffic, how much you're paying on your rent, what sort of house that you can afford. If you're in Sydney at the moment, you're about to see your water bills rise quite significantly in order to fund new housing developments in new, migrant suburbs in Sydney. So that's going to affect your water bills. To keep up with this population growth, we're also now desalinating water in major cities. That's a cost. There are costs left, right and centre for this mass immigration. And effectively, the federal government loves running this program because it collects about 80% of the tax revenue. So the feds love big migration because it makes the economy look stronger than it is. So at the moment, Australia's GDP has been growing very, very poorly, but it's been growing. But if you actually look at it a per person basis, we've had 9 quarters out of the past 11 where per capita GDP has gone backwards. So it's a way for the government to basically gloss over the fact that the economy is weak. They just import more people in the country that, people buy things, they create economic activity, it grows the pie, but everyone's share of the pie is actually getting smaller. And at the same time, the federal government also loves high immigration because it collects all the personal income taxes, which if you import more people, you get more workers, they pay income tax, the federal government gets that. They also get more company taxes. If you're a Harvey Norman, you got more people to sell to, you make more profits. But the cost of population growth then falls on the states who are drowning in debt. They've sold off everything they can. They're drowning in debt, especially if you're New South Wales and Victoria has to build all this stuff to keep up the migration. You go into massive debt. It also then puts costs onto you and I, not just all the things I've just talked about, but also, if you live in Sydney or Melbourne and you've had to build a new toll road in order to keep up with this population growth, well, then now you're paying tolls when previously you didn't have to. So if you're a resident in Sydney, at the turn of the century, you had about 2 toll roads. You had the Sydney Harbour Bridge and Tunnel, if you count them as one, and one near the airport. Now you've got about a dozen toll roads around Sydney. And you can't drive around Sydney without having to pay money to Transurban. And that's another symptom of this high population growth, because the state governments had to build all these tunnels and everything to keep up with population growth. And that's then effectively created a private tax. So these are all the sorts of issues that we care about when we talk about population and immigration.
Thank you. I mean, that's a masterful overview of the nutshell of the problems. I wanted to just drill into one part of that. So you mentioned the interest groups that are pushing for mass migration. You mentioned big business who love it because it puts downward pressure on wages, and the government that loves it itself because of the revenue. The other player here is, of course, universities that I think are probably the worst. And you've done a lot of work on this, basically exposing the export market myth. Now, yes, it's absolutely true that having foreigners come here to consume our education services is an export. I don't think that is contested in terms of a definition, but I think the universities will claim it was like $48 billion or something was the value of this export, saying, well, yes, there's a cost, but we're providing a massive benefit to the community through earning export revenue. But you've done a lot of work exposing that number is greatly exaggerated. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So the number's actually 51 billion is the latest. So this is the so-called fantastical $51 billion of education exports that the ABS measures. And they often claim it's Australia's 4th biggest export, but that number is wildly exaggerated. And I'll tell you why it's wildly exaggerated, because number one, the ABS counts all expenditure buy people on student visas as an export. So if you go to McDonald's, you buy a burger, that's that's an export. If you buy a roll of toilet paper, export. What it doesn't do, it doesn't net out money earned in Australia. So as we know, most international students who come here, especially if you're from, the subcontinent or whatever, you come here and you work while you study. And a lot of people actually use the student visa system as a backdoor work visa. They actually come here to work more than actually study. So especially if you use the private college route or something. But what the ABS doesn't do is it doesn't net out money earned in Australia, which then is spent on goods and services here. And obviously, if you earn money here and then you spend it, that's not an export. So they don't do that. And that is so the ABS estimates that around a quarter of that figure is money earned in Australia, but that estimate itself is wildly under-exaggerated because it doesn't count cash-in-hand jobs. It's only money earned in the formal economy. Also, money earned in some of the gig economy, so like food delivery, etc., hasn't been counted properly. So even that number is grossly exaggerated. The other thing they don't net out is migrant remittances. So that's money sent home. And according to the World Bank, the latest data there, it says that migrants in Australia have sent home net US $10 billion last year. And if you actually I've plotted that figure against the student visas and they track almost 1-for-1. And what they suggest is that a lot of students are actually sending money back home. So really, to get a true export figure, you need to net out the money that's earned in Australia, which the ABS has a loose estimate, but it's not really high enough. It doesn't count cash in hand jobs. And we know that migrants are actually, and students are one of the core groups that are subject to wage theft. So they work these cash in hand jobs. Also, they don't net out the remittances that are sent home, which again was about $10 billion US, so about 15 billion Australian last year. So there needs to be some of that also netted out. So I think the true figure is probably half what they estimate.
Yeah. And just, I guess, to sort of build on that, what I see happening is you've got, your typical person on the street that is very much opposed to the scale of the program that's coming in. I mean, we know from survey data, we've done our own surveys that show a strong majority want a cut, if not to temporarily pause the intake until infrastructure actually catches up. But you've got these powerful interest groups that are basically driving this agenda, and it's been both sides of politics that have been doing it, like you say, basically since 2004 at least. So do you sort of see an off ramp to this at all? How do we? Are we just now too addicted? Is the entire economy now too addicted to immigration, or is there sort of an off ramp that you can see to get off this mass migration path?
It's look, it's hard to say. I hope there is, but based on everything I've seen, I'm pretty skeptical there is, because unfortunately the Australian economy, the way it's structured, is where we've got our economy is quite frankly stuffed the way it's set up. And when I started the Australian Treasury back in the early 2000s, Ken Henry gave a presentation to us on my first day, and he spruiked the 3 Ps. So that's productivity, participation, and population. Unfortunately, we've given up on the first two, really. I mean, the participation rate's high, but the main one's productivity. That's the one that really matters. But that one is cactus, right? So our productivity growth stinks. And unfortunately, the easiest lever to pull, and that's one we've been pulling for the last 20 years, is just ramping up immigration and just growing growing the economic pie as quickly as you can by adding people, but not caring about the slice of the pie. And unfortunately, our economy has become just overly reliant on this, population fetish. And the drivers behind it, all the lobby groups, not just big business, you got the property industry, obviously you've got the education/migration industry. I call them an industry, really. They kind of join migration agents and education agents and universities and private colleges, all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, the biggest lobbyist of them all, if you want to call them that, is the Australian Treasury, like I just mentioned. Again, they love it. Easy way to grow tax revenue for them. And then they defer the costs onto everyone else, including the state governments. And what I'd really love to say, I think the way you could stop this is, but I just can't see it happening, is the premiers of New South Wales and Victoria need to unite and say to Canberra, look, you are bankrupting us. You're bringing all these people. We've got to provide the infrastructure and services for them. We can't afford to do it. We're drowning in debt. So if you want to do this, you need to give us $50,000 per new resident that lands in our jurisdictions. Not just in, New South Wales, Victoria, but they do get about 2/3 of the migrants. But really the federal government should give a cash amount, say 50,000, still wouldn't cover the cost, to try and internalize the cost of this migration. And that way the feds wouldn't just get the benefits and not worry about the costs. They'd have to share the costs And I think if they did that, which I'm sure they won't agree to, but this is, it'd be great to see the New South Wales and Victorian premiers lobby for this. If they did that, I guarantee you the numbers would fall, because the feds would go, oh, okay, this isn't just a free lunch anymore. We've now got to balance the benefits with the costs by every citizen migrant that lands in New South Wales or Victoria or Queensland. We've now got to give $50,000 to that state so they can help fund their infrastructure, their services, and all the things that they need to support that extra citizen. I think that's the way they should do it. But unfortunately, the way our vertical fiscal imbalance in this country is, with the feds collecting 80% of the tax revenue, there's this, incentive for them to run this really high migration forever, really. And it's baked into their numbers. They can grow the economy quicker. They can also improve the federal budget by doing this through extra personal income taxes, company taxes, but the costs go elsewhere and they fall on us, the states, in other areas.
The relationship between population and productivity growth is an interesting one, because the apologists of immigration say, well, actually, if we have a skills-based migration program, that will actually increase productivity because we're getting skilled workers into the economy. But even if you just sort of eyeball the charts of productivity growth and population growth, they're actually going in the opposite direction. And that's a relatively new phenomenon, is my understanding, certainly post-COVID. So is that because we're actually getting low-skilled people coming into the economy, or why does there appear to be now an inverse relationship between productivity growth and population growth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's been going for longer than COVID, but certainly it's been exacerbated since COVID. Basically there's an inverse correlation, not just here in Australia, but also in Canada. Canada's another place that this work has been done on, who also had a massive population rise as well through immigration. And I think it's for two reasons. So first of all, despite claims that we run a skilled migration program, we actually run a very unskilled migration program. So even if you take the permanent migrant intake, which is roughly 60% so-called skilled, within that, only around half of those are actually skilled people, because that includes secondary visa holders, like family members, that sort of thing. And even within that, most of the skilled migrants that we get, they don't actually end up working at their level of skill. So a classic example is the engineering. So 60% of engineers in Australia are foreign born, and yet half of those engineers, so 50% of migrant engineers are actually underemployed, not working as engineers. That's according to Engineering Australia, and that's similar across a whole bunch of industry classifications, whether that's accounting or etc. So we've got a massive underemployment problem with so-called skilled migrants, and then on top of that, we've obviously had the temporary migrant system, which is mostly unskilled. So I think that's the first issue of it. The second issue is that we've just grown the population faster than we've been able to expand business investment, so infrastructure and also housing. And as a result, we've got less capital per worker, and that's led to so-called capital shallowing. So if you actually look since the post-war period in Australia, the number one driver of productivity growth has been what's called capital deepening, and that's an increase in the capital to labour ratio. So if you think about it, giving workers more tools and machinery to work with, more technology makes them more productive. And I always use the analogy, just to make it simple for someone listening to understand what I'm talking about. If you run a cafe and you've got one coffee machine and two workers working that machine, and you can churn out 100 coffees an hour, if you double the number of workers with only one machine, you're not going to double the amount of coffees per hour. You're not going to suddenly make 200, because they're going to have to wait for each other, they're going to bump into each other, there's going to be congestion, that sort of thing. So that's what you call capital shallowing. You've increased the number of workers, but you haven't increased the capital to go along with it. Effectively, that's what Australia's economy has done. So our capital labour ratio has actually fallen in the last decade. And we've actually had capital shallowing, and that's negatively impacted our productivity growth. And exactly the same thing has happened with Canada. There's a chart that Jared Menak did, a really good economist in Australia, and there's one that the National Bank of Canada did, and they look identical. And both nations have had very poor productivity growth because they've effectively had a lessening in capital deepening, or another way to say it is capital shallowing more recently, whereby the capital labour ratio has actually fallen because we've grown the population so much more aggressively than we have been able to provide extra business investment or infrastructure and those sorts of things, and that's made us less productive. So it's a two-factor issue. the people that were brought in have been less skilled, which makes you less productive. And then we've also had too many people for the amount of infrastructure and business investment, which has made capital challenging. So that means the solution, Dan, is to run a much smaller system of highly skilled people, which, in areas of genuine shortage. Whereas we've taken the opposite approach. We're just running big numbers of low quality people. I shouldn't say low quality, but lower skilled on average. And that's overrun, which has been at a faster rate than we can build infrastructure or businesses can invest.
I think one of the interesting things there as well is housing. And one of the frustrations I've had in this debate is, there are those who will say, oh, well, stop scapegoating migrants for the housing shortage. And the point is, it's not the migrants themselves. I mean, of course, if you had the opportunity to come to Australia, of course, you'd take it. The problem is the lack of planning that's been there. And it's just so obvious that it's supply and demand. Like, yes, there's a supply issue where I think the time taken to build a new house has increased by 50% over the last decade. And a big part of that is the red tape and other non-government issues like getting resources and the actual people to do the job. But there's no doubt that pumping up demand has also increased the price. And it's so, frustrating to me that the trope used by the apologists is, oh, well, you're just blaming migrants. And I just want you to sort of tell us, just talk to us about the housing story, because that's something that touches the lives of every single Australian, particularly young Australians who want to be able to buy a home.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, this is purely a numbers game, right? So if you're going to, basically, if you want to solve this structural housing shortage that we've got, you need to run a migration system that is below the nation's capacity to build housing and infrastructure. Because infrastructure is also, fundamental as well. It goes hand in hand with housing. Unfortunately, we've run a migration program since really the mid-2000s. So Shane Oliver did some fantastic work, whereby, from 2005, when Australia's population suddenly population growth jumped by, 150,000 after we ramped up immigration, we never had the housing supply to respond to that. And as a result, Shane Oliver estimates that we've got a 200 to 300,000 housing shortage, cumulative. And in fact, during COVID, when immigration went negative for a bit, the housing shortage went down a lot. This is structural housing shortage. Now, people often say, oh, but prices went up because interest rates are obviously cut to close to zero. That's a separate issue. But the biggest area in the housing market where you see the shortage is actually the rental market. And in the last 5 years, according to Cotality, which is a housing data provider, they estimate that the median asking rent in the last 5 years has gone up by about $10,400. So, if you're a renter, if you're a median renter in Australia, you're now paying roughly $10,500 more than you were 5 years ago, which is a massive increase. We're paying a record amount share of income on rents now in Australia,
and you're not getting anything better. It's still the same place.
Yeah, that's it. So this is a direct thing. And here's the thing, Dan. So the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council is the federal government's own advisory council on housing supply and affordability. They released their State of the Housing Market report 2 months ago. And what it showed is that over the next 5 years, over this 5-year housing accord period, Australia's shortfall of housing is going to increase by 79,000. So that's because we've got this ongoing high immigration, and that's using the budget's forecast of immigration, not the higher level that we're actually at.
Yeah.
But even with the budget forecast, which is probably, conservative, let's be honest, the housing shortage is going to get worse by 79,000. And here's the rub. In the sensitivity analysis at the end of that report, they said that if population growth was merely 15% less than is estimated projected in the budget, instead of having a 79,000 shortage over the next 5 years, we'd actually have 40,000 surplus over the next 5 years. And that tells you in black and white, in the federal government's own advisory council, that the number one solution to this is to cut population growth. And the way you do that is through immigration. So what I don't understand is their own advisory council in their sensitivity analysis says, here's option A, status quo. You're going to have a worsening housing shortage of 79,000 homes on top of the 200,000 to 300,000 already. Or option B, slow population growth down. And over the next 5 years, with just 15% less, which just means still very strong population growth, just 15% less strong, you, instead of having a 79,000 shortage over the next 5 years, you have a 40,000 surplus. So that is the way you solve the problem here. You slow demand by slowing population growth. It's the easiest thing to do. It's also the most logical thing to do, especially when every opinion poll pretty much in the last decade shows that people don't support this.
Yeah, and that's on both left and right. Like this is not
And the migrants.
right. Yeah,
And
look,
within the
that's
migrant
right.
communities.
Yeah, 100%. Like I was a Liberal candidate at the election for an outer suburban seat in the suburbs of Adelaide, a lot of migrant areas there. And the thing you hear all the time is that I came to the country, it was affordable, it was easy to live, I could buy a house, but my kids, well, I don't know about what kind of future they're going to have. I mean, everybody shares this concern, particularly lower income people that bear the brunt, because they often live further out, so they deal with the congestion, they deal with all these issues more than the inner city types. There's less public transport and
100%.
and all the rest of it. So this is a massive issue. I want to talk about the actual numbers, because this is an area that is the source of a lot of confusion, and sometimes that confusion is caused deliberately by those who actually know what they're doing with the numbers. So if you can just explain the different measures of migration. So there's the net overseas migration figure. There's another number put out called, I think it's permanent and long-term arrivals and departures. And then we also have another figure which is to do with sort of visa, people who roll over, who already live here, they go from a temporary to a permanent visa as well. So there's lots of different numbers. Can you explain the different measures of migration, and what do you think is the best measure of the actual number of people that we have here?
Yeah, so the official measure is the net overseas migration. So what that is, that's effectively people who change their residency status based on living here for 12 out of 16 months. So if someone comes into Australia, or an Australian returns home if they've been overseas for a long time, and they live here for 12 out of 16 months, they classify it as a new migrant. A net, and the net in the net overseas migration just measures the people leaving versus the people coming based on that rule. The other measure, and the problem with that, the net overseas migration, it's not a problem. It's very lagged. So the last reading we have is the December quarter of last year. We're obviously in September now, and we will get the March quarter late this month. But because it's so lagged, economists and analysts and everybody basically uses a monthly figure as a proxy, which historically has tracked the net overseas migration figure very closely. And that's the net permanent long-term arrivals data. And that's released monthly by the ABS on a sort of 6-week lag. And it gives you a high frequency measure. And the difference between that and net overseas migration is that measures arrivals based on border movements. So when someone flies into Australia and they go to the airport, or they arrive by, on a ship, which is very few, but by the airport, you have to do a passenger card. And what you do is you basically say if you're coming here on holiday for short term, or you're arriving permanently, or you're planning to arrive long term. And what it does is it counts the people coming here permanently and long term, and they're part of the net permanent long term arrivals. And what the ABS measures is they measure the difference between the number of people coming in signaling that they're going to be here permanently or long term versus those who are leaving. And that gives you the net permanent long term arrivals data. And historically, that has tracked the net overseas migration number very closely in a directional sense. The actual numbers differ. And we pretty much everyone uses it to work out if net overseas migration is rising or falling, because we can't wait to find out what happened 9 months ago. We need to know what's happening now. The other measures are the permanent migrant intake. So the permanent migrant intake is the government sets that every year, and that's basically, it's been set this year at 185,000, which is close to an all-time high. It was 160 when Labor came to office. And then there's also the humanitarian intake on top of that, which is another form of permanent migrants. That's 20,000. That got increased by this current government from about 13,000. The permanent migrant intake is different. So permanent migrant intake can count people who've flown in to stay permanently, can also count people who are already here, say on a temporary visa, who then switch to a permanent visa. And what net overseas migration ultimately measures is effectively the permanent migrant intake plus the change in the number of people who are on temporary temporary visas. So it's a flow measure. So it's a flow of how many are coming in or out of Australia. And it's basically the sum of your permanent migrant intake, which is about 205,000 if you count the humanitarian intake. So that's 185 family and skilled visas, plus 20,000 humanitarians, plus the change in the number of temporary visa holders that are in Australia. That's effectively what your net overseas migration number is.
And that would be the more accurate number, in terms of if you want to know how many sort of people are actually here on a net basis, and therefore how's that going to affect our congestion, our infrastructure, and so forth? And none would be a better figure, wouldn't it?
Oh, actually, well, the best figure in that case is actually just the population change. So the population change is your net overseas migration plus the difference between births minus deaths, which is called natural increase.
Yeah.
And that'll give you the overall change in the population. But the thing that drives that is actually net overseas migration. So if net overseas migration was theoretically zero, Australia would basically have zero population growth because not initially, but if you go 10 years down the track or something, you'd have basically zero population growth or probably negative population growth. The reason being the birth rate's actually below replacement. And also if say 100,000 net overseas migrants come into Australia, some proportion of them are going to have children. And once they have children, they then get counted as natural increase. But if they never came, they wouldn't have children. So 100% of Australia's population growth actually comes from immigration, both as a migrant steps off the plane and then when they later have children. And when they later have children, it actually count as natural increase. But it's still, if they hadn't come, they wouldn't have had those children. So in fact, effectively 100% of Australia's future housing demand, 100% of Australia's population growth is from net overseas migration.
Wow. Can you talk us through this recent episode that you've had with the ABS and the ABC, effectively trying to censor what you've been saying or what we've been saying, because it gets to this issue of the different numbers that are used, and basically what happened. I mean, you could explain it in more detail, but in a nutshell, we've had the Australian Bureau of Statistics take a pretty extraordinary measure of reaching out to yourself and to a range of journalists and reporters who have been communicating this issue based on analysis we've done and that you've done on the permanent long-term arrivals data, and saying, well, this is not an accurate measure, and in essence asking to stop using this data as a part of the debate. I've never seen this happen before from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The ABC then ran something on their Media Watch segment basically saying the same thing. So clearly there's the wagons are being circled to try and really censor this debate. Can you talk us through what actually happened with the ABS?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was definitely a coordinated strike. So basically what happened, well, that's in my view anyway. What happened is, this net permanent long-term arrivals data that we've got up to June, right? So the first half of this year. And what it showed is that the first 6 months of the year was the strongest net permanent long-term arrivals we've had in Australia's history for the first half of a year in history. So it was about just under 280,000, like 279 something. So based on that, and based on the historical correlation between the net permanent long-term arrivals and net overseas migration, which if you plot them together on a chart for going back 30, 40 years, they follow each other very closely. So whenever one goes up, the other one goes up, etc. So based on this, we've had this big surge in net permanent long-term arrivals, the biggest surge in history in the past 6 months this year. Myself, the IPA, others were saying immigration looks like it's picking up again, which it is. And not just that, we've also seen other evidence. So we've seen rental vacancy rates have tightened again. So they've, according to Cotality, SQM Research, everyone, after loosening a bit last year when it looked like migration was falling, the rental vacancy rates have now tightened back to pretty much record lows. And asking rents have actually accelerated again after looking like they were easy last year. So that all the evidence is pointing that we've got higher migration again. It's picking up again from what it was in the December quarter last year, which is the last reader we've got. Now, the ABS sent me an email just saying, pointing out one of my articles, which merely said that we've had record net permanent long-term arrivals this year, plotted the chart against net overseas migration, said that it looks like migration's picking up again, and the rental market's feeling it because the rental market's tightening and rents are going up. And they basically pulled a red card on me for that. And then I found out they pulled a red card, I think, on you guys and a whole bunch of others, which was just crazy. I obviously put, clapped back at them, wrote articles, etc., saying they're trying to censor us because everyone's been using this net permanent long-term arrivals data as a leading indicator of migration forever. Like, it's always been done. The Centre for Population, which is a federal run out of the Australian Treasury, that's the federal government's own sub-department on migration matters. They released a handbook, a year or two ago, which on how to read migration statistics, they actually explicitly saying that the net permanent long-term arrivals is a leading indicator of migration, right? So everyone uses this. And crazily, the ABS has, someone I assume has pressured the ABS because they don't like the narrative that, net permanent long-term arrivals are at record levels and that, it reflects badly on the federal government. My assumption, this is just purely an assumption, is that they were leaned on to do this. And then, surprise, surprise, good old ABC Media Watch doing what they do, then came out and basically, attacked Ben Fordham at 2GB for merely reporting that we've had record arrivals, which is what the data says, et cetera, for, fake news, spreading migration hate, the fear of foreigners, all this sort of garbage, when all he did was report what the ABS was saying in the data. So this whole episode has just been a clown show, to be quite frank, and I don't like seeing the ABS do this. They should just report the data and let us duke it out about what it means. But for some reason they got involved, and I don't think it reflected very well on them. I took them to task on the radio, on my website, everywhere else, and I think it just raises a suspicion that Australia's institutions are becoming politicised now, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly that's the case. I mean, I think you look at the Productivity Commission, it's a shadow of its former self. I think the RBA's held up not too badly, but it's still in question. The Treasury is completely gone.
Oh, shocking.
Yeah, and the Treasury's gone as a, an institution of economic credibility.
Mate,
so
CSIRO as well.
Yeah.
Garbage.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the Edelman barometer, the trust barometer they have every year, you'll see in there for this year, I think it was released a couple of weeks ago, that it's like trust that Australians have in our institutions has plummeted. And something like 2/3 said they suspect that, politicians are lying and, others in major civic organisations aren't being truthful. So I think COVID did a lot of that, the narrative run by COVID. But when this happens, when the ABS, because everyone goes, oh, it's the ABS, it's just the data. And now people start to question, well, is this actually the data? Is it being politicised? I mean, what are we going to have left?
Yeah, that's right. And it was very strange because obviously, as I said, we use leading indicators all the time because we have to, right? Like look at the last migration read we got is December quarter last year. I mean, it's pretty useless. We're in September now. But, economists use they quote the monthly CPI indicator when it's not nearly as robust as the quarterly to get a read on inflation, right? And why isn't the ABS sending a note out to economists going, you shouldn't quote the monthly CPI indicator because it's not the official figure. The official figure is the quarterly CPI. Like economists always quote that as, I don't do it explicitly, but a lot of people quote that as inflation, when it's not actually inflation because it's the less robust figure. It's, only contains about 60% as much as what's in the quarterly basket. It's very volatile, that sort of thing. But, we use those leading indicators because we have to, because we can't sit around and twiddle our thumbs for 9 months while we wait to find out what happened, in the March quarter, which is basically what we're going to get. So, yeah, look, it was pretty stupid of the ABS, I think, to get involved, but I think it seems like they were leaned on. And, as you said, it just seems like all of Australia's institutions, whether it's CSIRO, AEMO with the net zero garbage and the rubbish reports they put out, complete propaganda or, this immigration sort of stuff, is, it's quite disturbing that once renowned institutions now just seem to be political playbooks.
Well, I think we'll leave it there, Leith, for today. I really appreciate your insights because you've been, I think, one of the few in this country that have been willing to speak out and do so with a very sound analytical understanding of the actual data and everything. I'd really encourage all of our members and viewers of this to check you out and go to your website and your social media. So just tell us, where can people find your work?
Yeah, so the mothership is macrobusiness.com.au, and I write about immigration pretty much every day in some way, shape, or form, and other areas as well. I'm a net zero skeptic and all that kind of thing. Also, I've got a YouTube channel, which is just, if you search my name, Leith van Onselen, you'll see it, and all that does is that just basically publishes my media appearances. I do lots of radio and things like that where I talk about these sorts of things. So those are the two areas really where you can find me.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think we'll be talking about this for a long time still to come, unfortunately. So thanks very much for your time and all the work that you do.
Yeah, cheers, Dan. Speak to you next time.